All right, in this third unit of the course, we're taking a look at another topic in applied ethics. This week we have articles on the legalization of drugs. The first reading selection, the Michael Huemer article, presents arguments for the legalization of drugs. Huemer's article, America's Unjust Drug War, and then later this week we'll take a look at an article by Marneff that presents arguments against the legalization of drugs. I would start into the topic with a general observation about why I think this is a difficult topic. If we go back to our founding documents, if we go back to some of the founding documents of the American Federal Republic, go back to documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If you look, for example, at the preamble to the Constitution, let's take a look at it for a moment. It cites a number of goals that we have, a number of things that we want government to do. The preamble to the Constitution is a statement of broad political and legal principles. And here again, those principles cite certain goals that we want government to promote. So the preamble to the Constitution says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Again, it presents a number of goals that we want government to promote. On the one hand, we want government to promote the general welfare. That is to say, we want government to promote the general well-being of society. It's also the case that we want government to secure the blessings of liberty. That is to say, we want government to protect our individual liberties. And that, of course, is a very strong and distinctive principle in American political and legal history. Americans always have believed very strongly, have always attached a lot of value to individual liberty in a way that's distinctive to American history. That's not true of every other country that you look at in history. But it is important principle in our political and legal tradition that the purpose of government is to protect our liberties. We want the individual to have a broad sphere of liberty, a wide latitude of freedom to make decisions about his or her own life. We want the individual to have a broad sphere of autonomy. We want women and men to be able to make choices that affect their lives, run their own lives, make their own decisions about matters that impinge on their own lives, and so forth. But again, it's also the case that we want government to promote the general well-being of society, promote the general welfare. Well, I would observe that those two goals are in tension. Those two goals sometimes come into conflict, and perhaps it's the case that they can't both be realized ideally well. This is an old problem in our politics. It goes back a long, long way, right to the beginning, as we see here. And I suppose it will always be with us, because the more liberty individuals have, the more freedom individuals have, the more likely it is that they will do things that will be detrimental to the general welfare, to the general well-being of society. So we see a case in point when it comes to this issue that we're discussing this week, the legalization of drugs. We know that lots of individuals being on drugs is detrimental to the well-being of society. So these two goals are in tension, and I suppose this tension, this conflict in our political principles will always be with us. I guess it's a matter of trying to strike the right balance between promoting the general well-being of society on the one hand and protecting individual liberties as much as possible on the other hand. So how to strike that right balance? There's no simple answer to that question, is there? And I think we see that when it comes to this issue of the legalization of drugs. Huemer and Marneff are definitely coming at it from two different perspectives. Huemer is coming at it from the point of view of a libertarian political philosophy. And libertarian political philosophy, as the name would suggest, attaches a lot of importance to individual liberty, attaches the most importance to liberty. That is the central value of libertarian political philosophy, namely liberty. And Huemer approaches this issue from that point of view. So he believes that, as the title indicates here, he believes that the drug war is unjust for reasons that we'll get into. The Marneff article, as we'll see later this week, approaches the issue more from the point of view of the general welfare, the general well-being of society. Marneff is someone who is much more inclined, is much more willing to restrict individuals' liberties in some ways if it's necessary to promote the general well-being of society. Again, Huemer attaches the most importance to liberty. He is willing to accept more in the way of harm to the general well-being in exchange for fewer restrictions, fewer infringements on rights. So that's we value both of these things, and that's why I think this is a hard issue. So, as the title as the title indicates, Huemer believes the drug war is unjust. Marneff, we will see later, does not. Marneff believes that the drug war is just and a good policy, and a policy that we should continue to support. So, a fundamental divergence of views here. Huemer argues that the recreational drug use should be legal. The government's criminalization of drug use is unjust. That is Huemer's view. So by recreational drugs here, we're talking about meth, heroin, cocaine, PCP, LSD, crack cocaine. That's marijuana. That's what we mean here by recreational drugs. We're not talking about drugs that physicians prescribe to help people who are ill. We're not talking about chemotherapy drugs or anything like that, obviously. We're talking about recreational drugs. Again, meth, heroin, cocaine, LSD, PCP, marijuana. Those are the drugs that Huemer thinks should be legal. And he believes government criminalizing the use of those drugs, criminalizing the manufacture and sale of those drugs is unjust. So most of this article is Huemer considering arguments for prohibition, and he finds none of them to be persuasive. He finds all of them to be unsound. What we mean by this term prohibition in this context is prohibiting drugs, either prohibiting drugs or that is to say making drugs illegal, or keeping them, continuing to make them illegal where they already are. So that's what is meant by prohibition in this context, in the context of the Huemer article and the Marneff article. But in the Marneff article, Marneff also uses this term prohibition in a different sense. Of course, the term prohibition also refers to a period of American history when the manufacture and sale of alcohol was illegal in the 1920s, mostly in this country. So prohibition also means that. We'll see that Marneff does talk about prohibition in that sense of the word as well. Again, this second article that we'll read this week, later this week, we'll talk about the Marneff article. And Marneff believes that prohibition was in many ways a good policy. It did a lot of good, he believes, and he thinks that the prohibition of drugs should follow that policy. He's not arguing that we should go back to the prohibition of alcohol, but he does believe that in many ways it was a good policy and it had a lot of good effects, as we'll see. And so he thinks that the prohibition of drugs, here again, making them illegal or keeping them illegal where they already are illegal, is a good policy and a just policy. The first argument for prohibition that Huemer considers would be this: drug use harms users. Government should prohibit people from harming themselves. Therefore, government should prohibit drug use. Okay, well, this is obviously a valid argument. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. But Huemer denies that that second premise is true. Government should prohibit, the second premise, government should prohibit people from harming themselves. Huemer would argue that's not true. It's not a legitimate function of government to stop people from harming themselves. So again, he's coming at it from the point of view of libertarianism as a political philosophy, and that is a political philosophy that attaches great importance to the limits on government's power. Government's power should be sharply limited, and the only justification for interfering with people from the libertarian point of view is to prevent them from harming others. But if they want to harm themselves, government has no rightful power, has no legitimate power to interfere. It's not government's business to stop people from harming themselves. That's Huemer's view. So obviously that argument is valid, but Huemer denies the second premise. It isn't true that government should prohibit people from harming themselves. Preventing people from harming themselves isn't a legitimate function of government. And that's Huemer's view. Consider people harm themselves in lots of ways. They harm themselves by smoking, by drinking too much, by eating unhealthy foods. But no one thinks it would be a legitimate function of government to criminalize these behaviors. Similarly, Huemer would argue it is not a legitimate function of government to criminalize the use of drugs. He has a long list of ways that people harm themselves. This is on page 468. He has a longer list here of the many ways that people harm themselves. On 468, he says, consider some examples of things people do that are harmful or entail a risk of harm to themselves. Smoking tobacco, drinking alcohol, eating too much, riding motorcycles, having unprotected or promiscuous sex, maintaining relationships with inconsiderate or abusive boyfriends and girlfriends, maxing out their credit cards, working in dead-end jobs, dropping out of college, moving to New Jersey, and being rude to their bosses. Apparently, he's not a fan of New Jersey. Then he asks, should the government prohibit all of these things? Most of us would agree that the government should not prohibit any of these things, let alone all of them. And then he goes on to argue that, similarly, it's not a legitimate function of government to prevent people from using drugs on the justification that they're stopping people from harming themselves. There are lots of ways that people harm themselves, Huemer would argue. But it's not government's rightful place to interfere and stop individuals from harming themselves. Now, I do have a question about this argument, a kind of critical thinking question for you to reflect on and think about. He offers that long list of ways that people harm themselves. Again, this is on page 468, smoking tobacco, drinking alcohol, eating too much, riding motorcycles, having unprotected or promiscuous sex, maintaining relationships with inconsiderate or abusive boyfriends and girlfriends, maxing out their credit cards, working in dead-end jobs, dropping out of college, moving to New Jersey, being rude to their bosses. Okay, so his point is well taken that yes, there are many ways that people harm themselves. But think about this. When it comes to these ways that people harm themselves, and you compare the kind of harm that is involved in using the kinds of drugs that we're talking about when it comes to the drug war. Here again, using meth, using heroin, crack, LSD, PCP. Let me suggest that this is a critical thinking question that one should reflect on in assessing this argument. Are the harms in those two cases, or in those two categories, I guess I should say, he gives a lot of cases, but are the harms in those two cases comparable? It is arguably the case that the harm done by those drugs is much worse than the harms done in a lot of these other cases that he mentions. That's something to think about. People harm themselves by smoking. Well, yes, smoking is detrimental to your health, but you can always stop. And if you stop, typically the harm to your health can be minimized. Drinking too much is harmful to one's health, that's true. But here again, one can always reduce how much one drinks, and if one does that, then typically the harm to one's health will very much be reduced. But in the case of something like meth, the impact is immediate and devastating and irreversible. Yeah, eating unhealthy foods, I mean, yeah, that could be harmful to your health, but you can always go on a diet and undo a lot of the damage that you did by eating unhealthy foods for a time. Think by way of contrast with meth. Think about meth by way of contrast. If you lose your teeth, there's no getting them back. That's a harm that is irreversible. If you lose your teeth to meth, that is a major hit to your health. It is very hard to be healthy with no teeth. So it's a real question, I think. Are the kinds of harms that Huemer is talking about in this article, are they really comparable? The argument on the other side might be that in the case of drugs like meth and heroin and PCP and LSD and crack, the harm is much more severe, is much more immediate, and in many cases is irreversible. And that the argument would be on the other side that justifies a difference in treatment. Yes, we do not criminalize these things, that is right. Although in the case of smoking and drinking, we do regulate that to some extent. But yeah, most of these other things, yeah, we don't want government to do anything about that, that's right. But again, in the case of something like crack, the impact, the damage to the brain is immediate and very significant and irreversible. And if crack gets into the hands of young people in particular, that can absolutely ruin their lives. Here again, if you eat unhealthy foods for a time, you can always go on a diet and start eating better. If you smoke for a time, you can always quit. If you drink too much, you can always quit or reduce back to a healthy level. But the damage done to your brain by crack is irreversible. Again, in the case of something like meth, losing your teeth to meth, that's irreversible. You can't get them back. So I think it's a real question about this argument. Are the kinds of harms that he's discussing, are they really comparable? Something to think about. He considers a number of ways that drug use is alleged to harm people. And in general, he finds that drug use does not harm people to the extent that it justifies government intervening and interfering with people's choices. So one way that drug use is alleged to harm people would be this. It's alleged that drug use prevents one from developing satisfying relationships. Okay, but this would be Huemer's argument. Even if that's true, it wouldn't be just for government to punish someone for failing to develop satisfying personal relationships. That's not against the law. Even if somebody does that directly, just intentionally fails to develop satisfying relationships, that's not against the law. It's not a legitimate government function of government to do anything about that. So if government prohibits drugs on the justification that the government is preventing people from harming themselves in this way, Huemer's argument is that that's no more justified than if the person were bringing about that result directly. As Huemer puts the point, if it would be wrong to punish people for directly bringing about some result, in this case failing to develop satisfying relationships, if it would be wrong to punish people for directly bringing about some results, suppose somebody just chooses to have no satisfying relationships. Okay, that's not a crime. So if it would be wrong to punish people for directly bringing about some result, then it would also be wrong to punish people for doing some other action, in this case using drugs, on the grounds that the action has a chance of bringing about that result indirectly. So if the argument is that drugs should be prohibited because they might indirectly bring about this bad result, well, Huemer's argument is that even if one directly brought about this bad result, that's not against the law. So it's no justification to criminalize something else on the grounds that it might bring about the same result indirectly. So that's Huemer's argument. Another way that drug use is alleged to harm people is this. It's alleged that drug use harms users' financial lives. costing them money and causing them to lose or not get jobs. But again, Huemer's argument is much the same here. It wouldn't be just of government to punish someone for ruining his or her financial life. If someone wants to do that, Huemer would argue it's not a legitimate power of government to interfere in that. He writes, suppose that I decide to throw all my money out the window for no reason. Should the police arrest me? I take it we all agree that it's not the place of the government to do anything about that. The police would not be would not be justified in arresting an individual for doing that. It's not against the law to ruin your financial life. If you want to throw all your money out the window, that's not against the law. So again, Huemer's argument is much the same. If it would be unjust for government to punish someone for bringing something about directly, in this case, his or her financial ruin, and here again, that is unjust. We believe that that's not a legitimate function of government. Well, if that would be unjust, then it would be unjust for government to punish an activity, that is to say using drugs, because it may bring about the same thing indirectly. So here again, if the justification for prohibiting drugs is, well, the drug use might indirectly bring it about that people ruin their financial lives. Huemer's point is that to ruin your financial life is not against the law. It's not a legitimate function of government to do anything about that. So it's no justification for government to criminalize something else on the grounds that it might bring about the same thing indirectly. So again, that's Huemer's argument. Another way that drug use is alleged to harm users that Huemer discusses is that it harms users morally, causing them to develop, for example, a decreased sense of duty and responsibility, unquote. Well, again, Huemer's argument is much the same. To be irresponsible is not against the law. He asks, would it be appropriate and within the legitimate functions of the state to punish people for being undutiful and irresponsible? Obviously not. We would certainly think that that is beyond the scope of government, that is beyond government's rightful powers to intervene in our lives, to interfere with our decisions on the grounds that we're being irresponsible. So again, Huemer's argument is much the same as in the case of the two previous arguments. Again, if it would be unjust for government to punish someone for bringing something about directly, in this case being undutiful and irresponsible, it would be unjust for government to punish someone for an activity. Of course, that what we mean here is using drugs. That may bring about the same thing indirectly. So again, his argument is much the same here. It's not against the law to be irresponsible. So it's no justification of government to criminalize some activity on the grounds that it might bring about that result indirectly. If somebody directly chose to bring about that same result, that's not against the law. So that's Huemer's argument, again. Huemer considers the argument that drug use is more harmful than other harms, and thus prohibition is justified in the case of the harms associated with drug use. So let's go back to the original argument for a moment. Prohibition argument 1, drug use harms users. Government should prohibit people from harming themselves, therefore government should prohibit drug use. So, as we've seen, Huemer thinks that the second premise is false. It's not true that government should prohibit people from harming themselves. It isn't a legitimate function of government to stop people from harming themselves. That's Huemer's view. With respect to this first premise, he doesn't exactly deny it in the article, but he spends a lot of time in the article minimizing it or downplaying it. I think a critical question about this argument would be, does he understate the extent to which drug use harms users? Even if he does, he's still going to regard this argument as unsound because he regards the second premise as false. But in general, he doesn't think that the kinds of harms that are associated with drug use rise to the level of justifying government in getting involved and intervening. So again, he doesn't exactly challenge the truth of that first premise, but he seems to suggest that drug use is not that harmful. now he does, now here again, somebody might argue in reply that drug use is more harmful than the other kinds of harms that he mentioned in that long passage on 468, where he lists lots of ways that people harm themselves. And then he went on to say that we wouldn't think it legitimate for government to get involved in preventing people from harming themselves in those ways. But somebody on the other side might reply in this way, look, that long list of harms that you mentioned, things like dropping out of college, things like staying in dead-end jobs, it is arguably the case, somebody on the other side arguing against Huemer, arguing against the legalization of drugs, might argue that drug use is more harmful than these other kinds of harms that he's talking about. So that might be an argument on the other side. So Huemer anticipates that argument. He considers the argument that drug use is more harmful than other harms, and that therefore prohibition is justified in the case of the harms associated with drug use. But he rejects the premise. He denies that drug use is more harmful than other harms. As evidence that drug use is not more harmful than other harms, he cites, for example, this kind of statistic. Now, this article is a few years old, so at the time he wrote it, the most recent statistics were for 2000. But he wrote that deaths from illegal drug use in 2000 were 17,000. By way of contrast, deaths from smoking were 435,000. So he cites these kinds of statistics as support for his claim that drug use is not more harmful than other kinds of harms. Well, I have a critical question about that aspect of his argument. Is there not an ambiguity to the argument? When he talks about drugs not being more harmful than other kinds of things like smoking, what he means by more harmful is harming more people. But when people on the other side of this issue argue that drugs are more harmful, they're not claiming that drugs harm more people than smoking. They're arguing that for the individual, a drug like meth or crack or heroin does more harm to that individual than these other kinds of harms such as smoking or eating unhealthy foods that he mentions. So it's a fair question, I think. Is there an ambiguity to the argument? When someone says that drugs are more harmful than other harms, does she mean more harmful in the sense that Huemer uses the expression? So consider this example. Being hit by lightning is more harmful than smoking. I think most people would agree that's a true statement. Most people would understand the sense of this claim to be true. But on Huemer's use of the phrase more harmful, it would be false, because more people are harmed by smoking. But here again, that's not what somebody means when they say being hit by lightning is more harmful than smoking. They mean for the individual to be hit by lightning is more harmful than it is to smoke. They don't mean more people are struck by lightning than smoke, obviously. They mean that is a more profound, a more damaging kind of harm to happen to an individual than the harms associated with smoking would be. So there's a kind of equivocation. There's a kind of shift in the meaning of the word harmful, in the meaning of the expression more harmful, as Huemer uses it. He uses more harmful to mean harming more people, but that's not what people on the other side of the debate mean when they say that drugs are more harmful than these other kinds of harms, such as smoking. They don't mean drugs harm more people than smoking. They mean to the individual, the damage of drug use is more serious, more significant than the harms associated with smoking or these other kinds of things that he mentions. So that's one critical question that I have about his argument. All right. Now, as we've seen so far, the argument was drug use harms the user. Government should stop people from harming themselves. Therefore, government should prohibit drug use. And we know what Huemer thinks about that argument. He thinks the second premise is true. He thinks the second premise of that original argument, that Prohibition argument 1, he thought that the second premise of that argument was false. It's not true that government should stop people from harming themselves. That is not a legitimate power of government. We've seen that that is Huemer's view. prohibition argument, too, is a different kind of argument. Somebody might argue against the legalization of drugs in this way. Drug use harms the user's family, friends, coworkers, and society in general. Second premise, government should prohibit people from committing these harms. Therefore, conclusion, government should prohibit drug use. All right, well, this may be a more difficult argument for Huemer to get around. As I said earlier, he comes at this issue from the point of view of libertarian political philosophy, a political philosophy that attaches the most importance to the value of individual liberty. And he tends to see drug use as an issue of individual liberty, as an issue of autonomy. If an individual wants to use drugs, he has a right to autonomy. He has the right to decide what to put in his or her own body. That's how Huemer looks at the issue. But as a libertarian, Huemer also has to agree that government is justified in stepping in and interfering with people once their behavior starts to infringe on the rights of others. A libertarian does agree with that. A libertarian does believe government is justified in intervening when it has to do so to secure the rights of others from being infringed, from being diminished by the behavior of other people. So this might be a harder argument for Huemer to get around. Again, the first premise, drug use harms the user's family, friends, coworkers, and society in general. Second premise, government should prohibit people from committing these harms. Therefore, conclusion, government should prohibit drug use. Okay, so this may be a harder argument for him to get around. Because libertarians do believe that government is justified in preventing people from harming others. And that's what this argument is saying. This is no longer an argument in terms of the harm that the drug user does to himself. This is an argument in terms of the harm that the drug user does to others. And just a general observation that I would make about Huemer's overall argument in this article is that he seems to very much downplay, he seems to very much minimize the extent to which drug use harms people besides the people who use the drugs. He seems to think that it's very easy to isolate self-harm from harm to society, self-harm from harm to others. But it's arguably the case that he understates in this article the extent to which drug use harms other people besides the user. Well, in the case of this second argument, Huemer denies the second premise. So again, the second premise is government should prohibit people from committing these harms. Huemer denies that because he does not believe that the kinds of harms that are involved, again, the first premise of the argument speaks of harms to family, friends, coworkers, and society in general of drug use. Huemer just simply doesn't agree that the kinds of harms that are mentioned here in premise one rise to the level of something that would justify government, the state, the law, in getting involved. Again, he denies the second premise of that argument. Although he agrees no one should be permitted to drive or operate heavy machinery while under the influence of drugs, nor should pregnant mothers be permitted to ingest drugs. Generally, he finds, drug use doesn't harm anyone in any relevant ways. That is to say, ways that we normally take to merit criminal penalties. Okay, so you'll have to decide for yourself what to think about that. He thinks that drug use does not, in general, harm anybody but the user, but it seems like somebody on the other side could raise a good objection to that claim. Is that really true? Seems like there are a lot of examples that you can point to of ways that drug use harms other people besides the user. And then I do have a kind of critical question about Huemer's argument at this point. In the passage I just read, he acknowledges that it is a harm to society if people are driving under the influence of drugs. He acknowledges that it's a social harm, a harm to others, not just the drug user, if a pregnant woman takes drugs. So he acknowledges that there are such cases, and he seems to acknowledge that the government would be justified in doing something about it. So in the cases where he allows the government has a right to try to prevent certain harms, say for example, people driving under the influence of drugs or pregnant women taking drugs, my question about the argument would be this: what else could government do but try to reduce the availability of drugs? He acknowledges these are social concerns, and he acknowledges government society would be within its rights to try to prevent these things. But when it comes to preventing these things, what could government really do other than try to reduce the availability of drugs? I guess you could say, well, a society can punish an individual who drives under the influence of drugs. Okay, punishing people who drive under the influence of drugs, that may deter some other people from doing that. That's right. But if somebody driving under the influence of drugs kills somebody, and then we punish them after the fact, well, the harm is already done. And so I think one critical thinking question about this argument would be this: is it prudent, as a matter of social policy, to wait for the harm to happen and then punish someone after the fact, after the harm has already happened? From the point of view of an effective, prudent social policy, somebody might ask, doesn't it make more sense to try to prevent the harm from happening in the first place? When it comes to the legalization of drugs, in general, a relevant observation would be that in general, if society allows something, we'll have more of it. So if drug use is legal, there will be more drug use, which means there will be more people driving under the influence of drugs. Okay, so again, he allows that people shouldn't be allowed to drive under the influence of drugs. He allows that shouldn't be allowed. Well, what can government do about that other than reduce the availability of drugs? I don't see what else government could do about it. Yes, punish people after the fact, once they get into a crash and kill somebody, punish them then, and that will deter some other people from doing that. But here again, that's punishing someone after the harm to society has already happened. And it seems like a real question. Is that going to be a wise social policy, to wait for the harm to happen and then punish somebody? As a practical social policy, would it not make more sense to try to prevent the harm from happening in the first place? And I don't see that there's any way to do that other than just to reduce the availability of drugs. In the case of pregnant women, here again, he says that's a bad thing. That is a harm to society. It shouldn't be allowed. Well, when he says it shouldn't be allowed, what does he propose to do? Again, in the case of pregnant women, what else could society do? Should we place police around them to prevent them from taking drugs? That is obviously totally impractical. It is not possible to place a number of police around a pregnant woman for 24 hours for 9 months. For all the pregnant women in the country, obviously that is totally impractical. So what else can society do to try to decrease this happening? I don't see what else society could do except try to reduce the availability of drugs. Again, if society allows something, we'll have more of it. So if drug use is legal, there will be more drug use, which means there will be more pregnant women taking drugs. Huemer acknowledges that that is a harm to society. He acknowledges that we are right to do something about it, but he seems not to recognize that, so far as I can see, the only thing we could do about it would be, the only thing that we could do in terms of trying to decrease it happening would be to reduce the availability of drugs. So that's one critical question that I have about his argument. Most of the article is Huemer considering arguments for prohibition, that is to say, arguments against the legalization of drugs, and finding fault with those arguments, explaining why in one way or another those arguments are not good arguments. That's most of the article. Towards the end, he gives a few arguments for his claim that the drug war is unjust, that prohibition is an injustice. One argument is this: a person has the right to exercise control over his own body. This is basically just what we've called autonomy a number of times now in the course. A person has the right to autonomy. Second premise, drug use takes place in one's own body. Therefore, conclusion, individuals have a right to use drugs. Okay. Well, here again, a critical question about this argument would be, I think this, with respect to the second premise, yes, it's true, drug use takes place in one's own body. That's true. But the effects of drug use may not be limited to the individual who takes the drugs. I think that's a fair question to ask about Huemer's argument. And then one other argument that he offers for his claim that drug prohibition is unjust would be this. It's unjust for the state to punish people without a good reason. Okay, well, obviously that is true. The first premise is uncontroversial. Nobody denies that. Second premise, there are no good reasons for drug prohibition. To his mind, Huemer has shown in the article that there are no good reasons for drug prohibition. But I've raised a number of reasons why somebody on the other side might challenge that second premise, might deny that that second premise is true.